The man at the corner table stopped eating first. He set his fork down slowly, not from distraction, not from surprise, but with the precise, deliberate weight of someone who has just heard something that cannot be unheard. He didn't look at Travis. Not yet. He looked at Nathan. My son was 9 years old. He was sitting 2 chairs down from me at a $40 a plate restaurant, wearing his father's old baseball cap, the one with the faded number 14 on the front, and he was trying very, very hard not to cry. That was the moment I knew exactly how far Travis had gone. But the worst things don't arrive all at once. They build. They test the edges of what you'll accept. They push a little harder each time. And they keep going long after any decent person would have stopped, because the person doing them has never once in their life been handed a consequence they couldn't talk their way out of. Travis Holloway had been testing edges his entire life. He just didn't know he'd finally run out of room. The Holston is the kind of restaurant in Knoxville where businessmen take clients they want to impress. Dark wood paneling, white tablecloths pressed so smooth they looked like paper. Lighting designed to make everyone in the room appear slightly more important than they actually were. Travis had reserved the center table on the main floor, 8 seats, positioned so that no matter where you were in the restaurant, you could see him. That was not an accident. Travis Holloway did not do accidental. He called it a family gathering. What it actually was, a celebration. 3 weeks earlier, Travis had completed the final round of paperwork to officially rename Holloway Brothers Construction. The company, my late husband Kyle, had spent 11 years building from a 1-truck operation into a 7-figure firm, to Holloway Group. Kyle's name was gone from the door. Mine had never been on it to begin with. And Travis had invited my son and me to dinner to mark the occasion. I came because Nathan wanted to see his cousins. That was the only reason I gave. The other reason I kept to myself, the way I had been trained to keep things. I had learned, in 12 years of Army intelligence, that the best time to collect what you need is when the other side has already decided they've won. Travis stood before the appetizers arrived. He had the easy confidence of a man who has never had to seriously question his own authority, the kind that doesn't come from earning respect, but from never being challenged long enough to need it. He picked up his glass, looked slowly around the table, and let the moment settle. To the Holloway name. He spoke with the unhurried warmth of a man addressing his own eulogy, which I suppose in a sense he was. Kyle spent 20 years building something with weight, something real, something you can touch, hand down, point to, and say, "That's mine, that's ours." A small pause. He was practiced at pauses. Not everyone understood that kind of commitment. Some people were built for different things. His eyes found me across the table. "No offense, Sarah." A few people smiled, the polite, uncertain smiles of guests who don't know if they've just witnessed something unkind. I lifted my water glass and drank. Travis sat back down. He ordered a second whiskey. Then a third. And somewhere between the entrees arriving and the dessert menus being passed around, the leash Travis usually kept on himself came off entirely. "You know," he said to no one in particular, but pitched loud enough for the whole table, "Kyle used to call me when Sarah left on deployment. Not every time, but enough. He'd say, 'Travis, it's just me and Nathan again.' And I'd drive over. We'd watch the game. I'd put Nathan to bed." He glanced at his business associates with the gentle, suffering look of a man describing an inconvenience he had cheerfully absorbed. "That's what family does." The contractor from Maryville, a man named Dale, whose last name I'd already stopped caring about, nodded with slow sympathy. "Must have been hard," he said, "raising a kid basically solo like that." Nathan looked up from his plate. Travis did not correct him. "Kyle was a strong man," Travis said instead, swirling his glass. "He made the best of the situation he was in." I set my fork down. "The situation," I said quietly, "was that I was serving our country." Travis looked at me with the patient, faintly exhausted expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Of course." He smiled. "No one is saying otherwise, Sarah." Then Renee, Kyle's mother, who had been seated at the far end of the table and had been so uncharacteristically quiet for most of the evening that I had foolishly mistaken it for restraint, leaned forward. "Kyle loved you," she said to me, in the careful, tender tone people use when they mean the precise opposite of what they're saying. "He truly did. He wanted a partner who could be present. He told me that once. He said, 'Mom, most days I feel like a single father.'" She touched the string of pearls at her collarbone. And I feel terrible repeating it. I do. But I think Kyle would have wanted Nathan to know the truth about his parents' marriage. Nathan was 9 years old. He was sitting right there. He heard every word. I watched my son's face go very still the way a child's face goes still, when they are in the process of deciding whether something they've just been told is real, and whether they are allowed to be hurt by it. His hands dropped into his lap. He stopped eating. He didn't look at Renee. He didn't look at Travis. He looked at me, and the question in his eyes was one I was not prepared to answer in that room, at that table, in front of those people. I held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then I looked back at Travis. Travis refilled his glass. He was warming up now. You could see it in the way his posture loosened, the way he began making small gestures with his free hand, turning to one person, then another, as though working a room. He talked about legacy, about what it really means to invest in something, to commit, to stay. He talked about the company, about his father, about Kyle. And every story he told was true in the way all of the most effective lies are true, accurate in the individual facts, corrupted in the shape they made together. There are two kinds of people, he said at last, with the magnanimous shrug of a man who has divided the world to his own advantage. People who build, and people who pass through. He paused. Both are necessary. Both have their place. You just have to be honest about which one you are. Nobody at that table looked at me. Which meant they all were. Dale leaned toward the woman beside him. His voice was low, but not low enough. Hard on the kid, he said. Growing up without a mother around. His companion nodded with her eyes closed. Travis heard it. He did not correct him either. I noticed that Nathan had reached up and pulled his father's baseball cap down low over his forehead. He does this when he doesn't want anyone to see his face. He has done it since he was 6 years old, and I first came home from a deployment, and he didn't want me to see that he'd been crying. He learned it, I later realized, from watching Kyle. My husband used to do the same thing on hard days, tug that same cap down, let the brim block his eyes. Buy himself a moment he didn't have to explain. The cap on Nathan's head that night was the same one. Number 14. Kyle's number from his college baseball team. Nathan had found it in Kyle's closet 8 weeks after the funeral and refused to take it off for most of October. I never asked him to. Travis took a long sip and set his glass down with the delicate self-satisfaction of a man who has been drinking just enough to believe his own performance. And then, because the whiskey had convinced him he was untouchable, or because 12 months of getting away with everything had made him sloppy, or simply because he had never in his life had to consider the possibility that the quietest person in the room was also the most dangerous, he said the thing that ended him. He turned to his associates, to his mother, to the clients and contractors and neighbors who had spent the better part of a year watching him generously, patiently, heroically manage the estate of his poor, dead brother, while the dead brother's military wife stood awkwardly in the margins of her own life, and he smiled. You know what the real difference is, he said, between a soldier and a wife? He looked around the table. He made sure he had the room. One of them actually comes home. 2 people laughed. One of them covered his mouth immediately, as if surprised by himself. The other didn't bother. Nathan's chin dropped to his chest. He reached up with both hands and pulled his father's cap down until the brim touched his nose. And for 3 full seconds, the only sound I could hear in that entire restaurant was the pulse in my own ears. I did not speak. I did not move. I sat with my hands flat on the table, my water glass 3 inches to my right, the remains of a meal I had barely touched in front of me, and I looked at Travis with a steadiness that I had not manufactured in that moment, because I had not needed to. It was simply there. 12 years of sitting in rooms where powerful, dangerous, hostile people were making decisions that affected lives they did not value. You do not come out of that needing to perform composure. You either have it or you don't. Patricia, who was not at that dinner but who I called the moment I got to the parking lot, would later describe it as the look I used to give a target before filing the report. She said she had only ever seen it once in person, and it made her check the door behind her. From the corner of the restaurant, I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back. Slowly, deliberately, the way someone moves when they are in absolutely no hurry, because they have already decided what they are about to do. I want to tell you something before I go any further. I knew General Marcus Webb was in that building. I had known for 4 days. He was 3 rooms away, hosting a Veterans Business Roundtable fundraiser dinner in the private dining suite at the back, the event that had been listed in the Knoxville Business Journal on the same page as the brief, celebratory announcement of Holloway Group's official relaunch. I had not arranged for him to be there. I want to be clear about that. I had no way of knowing he would come into the main dining room. No way of predicting what Travis would say at the precise moment the door between those two spaces happened to be open. Some things are not plans. Some things are simply the accumulated weight of someone else's arrogance pressing down until the floor gives way. What I had arranged was everything else. But to understand what that means, I need to take you back 20 months to a Tuesday night in September, and a phone call that arrived at 11:47 p.m., and the sound of a man's voice on the other end of the line that was perfectly, precisely, unnervingly calm. Kyle died on a Tuesday. He was driving home from a late parent-teacher conference at the high school where he taught history. He had taken the long way, the way that goes past the baseball field where he coached the junior varsity team, because he always did that when he had a good day. He told me once that driving past that field at night, seeing the lights still on, made him feel like the work was still there waiting for him, like nothing had ended just because the day had. He liked that feeling. He looked for it. A driver going 22 miles over the speed limit ran the light at the intersection of Chapman Highway and Sevier Avenue at 11:23 p.m. He had a blood alcohol level of 19. Kyle was 41 years old. He coached the team. He called me every single night I was deployed, every night, without exception. And he never once opened those calls by talking about himself. He always said, "Tell me something normal. Tell me what Nathan ate for dinner. Tell me what it looks like outside." He said it because he knew that what I needed. After 12 hours of tracking threat assessments and staring at intelligence feeds and calculating the weight of decisions that could not be undecided, was the sound of my ordinary life being held carefully in someone else's hands. He was the only person in the world who understood what that meant to me. He was also, I would later come to understand, the only person whose existence had been standing between me and what Travis had always intended to do. The call came at 11:47. I was in the kitchen, still awake, finishing a defense contractor report I was supposed to submit by morning. Nathan was asleep upstairs. I had been out of the Army for 8 months, the longest stretch of uninterrupted home life I'd had since Nathan was a year old, and I was still learning what it felt like to be in the same place 2 days in a row. The number on my phone wasn't the police. It was Travis. "Hey, it's Travis." A pause I would revisit many times in the months that followed. "Something's happened to Kyle. I need you to stay calm." His voice was even, measured, the voice of a man who had been preparing for this moment, or a man who was very good in a crisis. I would not be able to tell the difference for another 14 months. The weeks after Kyle's death are not something I can fully reconstruct in sequence. There are gaps in that time that I've come to understand are not failures of memory, but the mind's sensible response to load it cannot process in real time. I know certain things happened. I know they happened in a certain order. I know that I stood in the kitchen of my house 3 days after the funeral and could not remember whether I had eaten that day, and that Nathan found me standing there and said, "Mom, your hands are shaking." And I looked down, and he was right. Travis handled the funeral. He made the phone calls, coordinated with the funeral home, chose the readings, managed the guest list for the reception. He handled it the way he handled everything efficiently, thoroughly, with a quiet authority that everyone in Kyle's life immediately accepted because someone had to do it and he was already there. Renee cooked and brought food every other day. Members of Kyle's church filled the kitchen with casseroles and covered dishes and desserts that nobody ate. The condolence cards accumulated on the counter until Nathan asked me if we were going to read all of them, and I told him, "Yes, sweetheart, we will," and we read 5 of them together before he fell asleep on the couch, and I put the rest in a drawer. 6 weeks after the funeral, Travis came to the house with paperwork. "Just a temporary measure," he said. He was sitting at my kitchen table with a folder of documents that he'd already tabbed in 3 places, with color-coded adhesive flags, orange for signature lines, yellow for initials. The meticulous preparation of someone who has done this before, or who had been coached by someone who had. It's a power of attorney limited scope. It just means I can handle the business filings while you get back on your feet. Kyle would have wanted the company protected. He would have wanted to make sure the LLC stays active, the contractor licenses renew on schedule. "You don't want to deal with all of that right now, Sarah. Let me carry it for a while." He said it with the gentle reasonableness of someone offering to carry groceries. He was my brother-in-law. He had just coordinated my husband's funeral. He was sitting in my kitchen, across from the chair Kyle used to sit in, and he was telling me that he only wanted to help. I asked him 3 questions. I asked what the scope of the POA covered. He said business filings only. I asked how long it would be active. He said 6 months, maybe 12, just until probate cleared and things stabilized. I asked whether I should have an attorney review it first. He looked at me with the soft, wounded patience of someone who has just been accused of something by a person they love. Sarah, he said, I'm family. I signed the power of attorney 8 weeks after Kyle was buried. At the time I signed, Holloway Brothers Construction was carrying an estimated value of $847,000 in business assets. Kyle's ownership share, which passed to me upon his death, was $423,500. The company held 2 commercial properties under its LLC structure, a lot in West Knoxville and a warehouse on the south side of town. Both properties were listed in the LLC under Kyle and Travis's joint names. Both of those properties, in the weeks following my signature on that document, were quietly transferred into Travis's name alone through a series of LLC restructuring filings that I did not know were happening, had not been informed of, and would not discover for 14 months. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew that the coffee Travis brought me that afternoon tasted like kindness. I was wrong about what I was drinking. The first sign that something was wrong arrived 5 months later, in the form of silence. Until then, Travis had been sending monthly summaries, brief emails with attached spreadsheets, balance figures, notes on active contracts. They were vague in the way that documents produced to satisfy an obligation rather than inform a decision are always vague. Numbers without context, totals without line items, the skeleton of transparency with all the useful tissue removed. I had accepted the vagueness as a condition of grief and transition. In the first year after losing someone, you accept a great many things you would not otherwise accept, because the alternative is fighting on every front simultaneously, and you do not have the bandwidth for that. You triage. You let some things go. Travis was counting on exactly this. Then in February, the email stopped. I texted Travis and asked about the February summary. He replied 3 days later, "Accountant's behind. Don't worry about it." I texted again in March. He read it and did not respond. I could see, in the little double-check marks of the messaging app, that he had read it. He just decided not to answer. There is a particular kind of contempt in that, in being visible enough to know you've seen something, and confident enough not to respond, that I filed away carefully. In April, Renee called. Not Travis. "Renee, Travis is doing his best, Sarah," she said, with a sighing patience that implied I was the one creating difficulty. "He's managing a lot right now. He's carrying the weight of the business, the properties, all of Kyle's affairs. Give him some room to work." I said I understood. I thanked her for calling. I hung up and wrote down the time and date and her exact words. It is a habit from Army intelligence that I have never been able to turn off the same reflex that made me, on my first day in the field, begin a running log of everything said in every room I entered. The same habit that my first supervisor called obsessive and my second supervisor called the reason he wanted me on his team. You document. You date it. You create a record that cannot be edited retroactively. You do not know what you are building until you need to use it. Then you know exactly. That summer, I began to notice smaller things. Contractors I had met at Kyle's company events stopped returning my calls about timeline questions I had every legal right to ask. A shared business checking account that Kyle and I had jointly held a personal account, not the business LLC, the one we used for household expenses tied to Kyle's income, showed a withdrawal of $4,100 in June for a vendor I didn't recognize. When I called the bank, they told me the withdrawal had been authorized by a co-signatory. Kyle was the only other co-signatory on that account. Kyle had been dead for 9 months. I didn't call Travis. Not yet. I had been trained in environments where an action taken at the wrong moment can collapse an entire operation. I had learned to wait for the geometry to be right before I moved. In July, Renee invited us to her birthday dinner. She turned 68 that year, and the party was held at her house, a long table set in the backyard under white lights. The extended Holloway family gathered around it. Travis's wife Lisa, their 3 children, cousins and second cousins, and people whose connection to Kyle the first had never fully worked out. There were perhaps 20 people. The food was good. The wine was open. From the outside, if you were driving by and could see through the fence, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be. a family gathering. I knew within 20 minutes of arriving that we were not welcome there. Not the way a guest is unwelcome, not rudely, not obviously. The way an afterthought is unwelcome. The conversation closed in small increments whenever I tried to enter it. Questions directed to Nathan were phrased in the specific, overly tender way people use with children they pity. Lisa smiled at me twice across the table with the soft, opaque smile of someone who has been told a story about you and decided to believe it. Renee gave a toast before the cake came out. She stood at the head of the table with her glass raised and spoke about family, about the particular grace of having people around you who show up, who stay, who build roots rather than leave them behind. She named her grandchildren one by one, as grandmothers do: Michael, Amy, Jack, each name carried with the warm specificness of a person who has memorized every detail of a child's life. She paused after Jack. She looked at Nathan, who was sitting to my left, wearing the cap. She smiled at him the way you smile at a child when you want everyone watching to think you feel something warm. And then she moved on. She did not say Nathan's name. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He was 9, not 4. He sat very still for the rest of the toast, and when the applause came, he put his hands together exactly once. Later, when Renee was cutting the cake and the table had broken into smaller conversations, Nathan slipped away and found her in the kitchen. I was standing near the back door and could hear them through the screen. "Grandma Renee," Nathan said. "Why didn't you say my name?" Renee made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. The carefully constructed sound of a woman about to perform graciousness. "Of course you're special, Nathan. You know you are. You're Kyle's boy." A pause, and in the pause I could hear her deciding how far to take it. "But the things your daddy built, his business, the properties, all of that, those belong to the Holloways, who were always here, who stayed." Her voice softened into something almost tender. "Your mama chose to be away a lot of the time. That was her choice to make. Family means being present, sweetheart. Present. Consistently. Year after year. That's what it means." I heard Nathan take a breath. "But she was in the army," he said. "I know," Renee said. "And we respect that. We do. But there are choices. There are always choices." Nathan came to find me near the back door a few minutes later. He didn't say anything right away. He stood beside me and looked at the yard where his cousins were playing. And I looked at his face. And what was on it was not grief exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something that happens to children when they begin to understand that adults who love them can be wrong, or dishonest, or can say things designed to wound, and they don't yet have the language for that discovery. He turned to me. "Mom, did you love Dad?" "More than anything, buddy." He was quiet for a moment. "Then why does Uncle Travis say Dad would have wanted me to live with them instead of you?" I put my hand on the back of his neck. I felt him lean into it slightly. "Your dad wanted you with me. That's why he chose me." I kept my voice very level. "That's why he asked me to marry him. And that's why I said yes. And that's why we built our life together. You were the center of that life. You still are." Nathan thought about this with the serious, methodical way he has of thinking through things that matter. Then he nodded. Once. He adjusted his cap. He walked back out to the yard and rejoined the cousins, and I stood at the screen door and watched him go with my hand still raised from where I'd had it on his neck, and I held myself very still until I was sure my expression was something I could have stood in front of a mirror and not been embarrassed by. Then I took out my phone and called Patricia. "Pat, how fast can you get me the full paperwork trail on the Holloway LLC? Define full. Everything. Incorporation documents, amendments, property transfers, any filings in the last 18 months. A short pause. Give me 48 hours. Take 36. I thought about Kyle every day. I still do. I thought about the voicemail he left me 2 days before he died. A short one. The kind he left when he was just thinking about me and wanted me to know. I had played it so many times in those first months that I had every pause and breath of it memorized. The slight hitch in his voice on the word always, which I came to believe was not an editing artifact, but simply the sound of him meaning it fully. I never deleted it. I never will. The call from Patricia came on a Thursday morning in September, exactly 1 year and 4 days after Kyle died. Patricia Gould had been my closest friend at Fort Belvoir, where we'd worked adjacent assignments in the intelligence analysis pipeline for almost 3 years. She was now running a paralegal consulting practice out of Nashville, handling discovery documentation for private litigation firms. She called me at 8:15 the morning, which told me she had been sitting on whatever she needed to say for at least a few hours, because Patricia did not make early phone calls unless she had already thought through all of her words. Sarah, do you know about the SBA loan? A long pause on my end. What SBA loan? The one filed 8 months ago under Holloway Group LLC, $650,000, VA-backed. Using veteran business ownership eligibility. Another pause. Your eligibility, Sarah. Travis listed you as a 51% owner of Holloway Group to qualify for a preferential lending rate. I sat down. I had been standing at the kitchen counter. I sat down on the tile floor. I found it by accident, Patricia said. I was pulling public records for another client. Your name is right there on the loan application. Your service record, your discharge status, your VA credentials. Travis used all of it to access a federal small business program you didn't know existed, for a company you didn't know you owned, to borrow money you didn't know had been borrowed. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. I heard the sound of my own refrigerator humming. Nathan was at school. The house was completely quiet. Where did the money go? I asked. Commercial real estate. Gatlinburg. A vacation rental compound, 3 cabins on the same property. It's been generating somewhere around $14,000 a month in rental income. Into a business account in the Holloway Group's name. A pause. Which Travis controls exclusively. I sat on that kitchen floor for a few minutes after we ended the call. I was not crying. I was not panicking. I was doing something I had done in more high-stakes situations than I could count, which was the thing the Army had spent 12 years training me to do. I was building the picture. I was laying out what I knew and what I didn't know, and what I needed to find and how to find it. I was running the geometry. The first call I made was to Janet Morse. Janet had been recommended by Patricia, a Nashville attorney who specialized in federal fraud and family estate litigation, with a background in JAG Corps consulting. When I reached her assistant and said I needed an urgent consultation involving VA loan fraud and a fraudulent power of attorney, I was on her calendar by the following Tuesday. In the meantime, I did not call Travis. I did not call Renee. I did not post anything on social media, did not speak to any of Kyle's former business associates, did not do anything that could be observed, recorded, or used to suggest I had been tipped off. I had spent a career in environments where the most important thing about what you know is controlling when other people find out that you know it. I told Nathan I was doing some paperwork. He nodded and went back to his book. 4 days after Patricia's call, I drove to the east side of Knoxville, to a small brick house on Sevier Avenue that had belonged to Kyle's father before he died in 2015. The property had been sitting in an administrative hold, technically part of the Holloway estate, currently rented month to month to a man named Gerald, who had been a friend of Travis's since high school. I knocked on the door on a Wednesday afternoon and introduced myself as Kyle Holloway's wife. Gerald opened the door wide and said he was sorry about Kyle. He truly was. And yes, of course, I could come in and look around. I wasn't looking for what I expected to find. I was following a thread Patricia had pulled when she started mapping the documents, a storage reference in one of Travis's early LLC filings, an address that showed up in 2 different places in the business records. I went to the basement because that's where the reference pointed. The light down there was a single bulb on a pull chain. The smell was cedar and dust. Against the far wall, behind a stack of folded outdoor furniture, I found a plastic storage bin with a label on the lid in Travis's handwriting. K Estate Records. Inside, folders, organized, dated, tabbed. The meticulous archive of a man who was very confident he would never need to explain himself. Business filings, LLC, restructuring documents, bank correspondence. A folder labeled Probate Timeline that contained a flowchart I recognized, because I had learned to make similar ones myself. A decision tree for managing the legal transfer of an estate, with boxes and arrows and contingency branches. My name appeared twice in that flowchart, both times in boxes that branched toward outcomes Travis preferred. And at the bottom of the bin, under the folders, a single-page calendar from the previous year, month of August. The pages for most months had been torn out, but August was intact. The 14th had been circled in red pen that was Kyle's birthday. But the 21st was the one that stopped me. August 21st, 3 weeks before Kyle died. In the box for that date, in Travis's handwriting, J. Ferris, Estate Addy, Act Ref, 0847, th. If K window equals 6 months, POA. I stared at that calendar page for a long time. The single bulb above me hummed. Gerald upstairs was watching something on television. The sound came through the ceiling in a thin, cheerful ribbon that had nothing to do with where I was standing. Travis had not started planning after Kyle died. He had started planning before. I photographed everything in that bin. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. I carried the bin back to its position against the wall. I folded the outdoor furniture back the way it had been. I thanked Gerald at the door, told him nothing, and drove to the end of the block before I pulled over and sat in my car for 11 minutes. I was not thinking about Travis. I was not thinking about the money. I was thinking about Kyle driving home past the baseball field the night he died, taking the long way because he'd had a good day and he liked looking at the lights. And I was thinking about whether, in some calculation I would never fully understand, the timing of that night had been clean. Whether August 21st had not been the beginning of a contingency plan, but the beginning of a plan that required a contingency to be manufactured. I do not know the answer to that. I will never know the answer to that. What I know is what the paperwork shows, and what the paperwork shows is damning enough. I filed a formal complaint with the SBA Office of Inspector General 11 days later, on a Friday. The following Monday, Janet Morse began the process of challenging the power of attorney on the grounds of misrepresentation of scope and fraudulent application of its authority. She filed a separate action in federal district court regarding the VA-backed loan application. The Friday after that, Travis sent me an email inviting me and Nathan to dinner at the Holston to celebrate the official relaunch of Holloway Group. I accepted. What Travis did not know, what Travis had never once in 18 months of scheming thought to consider, was that the day before he sent that invitation, I had already met with Janet for 2 hours to review the evidentiary package we had assembled. He thought he had 18 months before the statute of limitations clock ran out on a power of attorney challenge. He had 11 weeks. I want to tell you about the moment in that restaurant when General Webb stood up. I saw him before Travis did. He came through the connecting door from the private dining room slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has decided to enter a space and has no concerns about being there. He was older, silver at the temples, the kind of military posture you do not lose in retirement, a face that had settled into something neither hard nor soft but simply precise. He was not in uniform. He didn't need to be. There are men who wear their rank in the way they stand, the way they hold the floor under them, and General Marcus Webb was one of them. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table. He didn't look at Travis, he looked at me. I had met General Webb exactly once, briefly, at a Fort Belvoir transition ceremony before my discharge. He had been introduced as the former J2 intelligence director for AFRICOM, the man who had approved the operational parameters for a series of intelligence missions in the Sahel region in 2019, including one in which the analysis produced by a team I was part of working under my callsign, Wraith, had identified an ambush site in advance of a scheduled helicopter extraction. 40 personnel were evacuated without casualties. The mission went into the classified record. The callsign went with it. He had heard Travis say it. He tilted his head slightly, the almost imperceptible recognition of someone locating a known data point in an unexpected setting. Then something settled in his expression. His chin lifted. His shoulders dropped back, not tensed. The opposite the way a person's posture shifts when they are in the presence of someone they consider a peer, someone they respect enough to stand straight for. He walked toward our table. Travis saw him coming and straightened up the way civilians do around senior military figures, even when they don't know who specifically is approaching some residual cultural recognition of earned authority. He began to smile, the eager, slightly performative smile he used with important strangers. General Webb stopped at the edge of our table. He looked at me. CW3 Coleman. A pause. Wraith. He stood at attention, and he saluted. Not Travis. Not the table. Me. He held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he lowered his hand. He looked at Nathan briefly, looked at the cap, the number 14, then back at me with something in his expression I did not analyze in the moment because I was too busy watching Travis's face. Then Webb returned to the private dining room. He did not look back. He did not explain. Some things do not require explanation. The table was completely silent. The contractor from Maryville Dale said, in a voice that came out much smaller than his earlier voice, "Who is that?" Someone at the far end of the table said it quietly. Marcus Webb, 3-star general. He chairs the Veterans Business Advisory Board for the Southeast. Travis was looking at me. For the first time in 18 months, for the first time since the night he called me from the side of a road and told me to stay calm, I watched Travis Holloway look at me with something other than certainty. It was brief. It was there, and then it was managed, and then it was gone. But I had spent 12 years learning to read the flickers that happened before the management. He knew. Not everything. Not the details, not the documents, not the timeline of what was already in motion. But he knew, in the way people who have been running something fraudulent always know at some subterranean level, that the room had shifted. I leaned toward Nathan. He was still sitting very still, the cap brim low, hands in his lap. "Hey," I said softly. He looked at me. "You know what your dad used to call me? In private?" He shook his head. "Wraith." Nathan's forehead creased. "What does it mean?" "It means someone who shows up exactly when needed and doesn't leave until the job is done." I straightened. He said it like it was the best thing he'd ever heard. Nathan looked at me for a moment. Then he reached up and adjusted his cap, not pulling it down, but tilting it up, the way his father used to when he wanted to see more clearly. He looked at Travis. Then he looked at his plate. I stood up. "Thank you for dinner, Travis." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I had never in my life seen Travis Holloway unable to produce words for a situation. And I want to be honest. I had thought it would feel like more. It felt like the end of a long document. A final signature. A date in a box that was now closed. I took Nathan's hand. We walked out through the center of the Holstons' main dining room. Past every table, past every person who had heard what Travis said and laughed or looked away or said nothing. I didn't walk fast. I didn't look back. In the parking lot, Nathan said, "Mom." "Yeah. Dad didn't say those things Uncle Travis said," he said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I knew your dad." Nathan thought about this. "Is Uncle Travis in trouble?" I pressed the key fob. The lights on our car blinked twice in the dark. "He's been in trouble," I said. "He just didn't know it yet." The SBA Office of Inspector General opened a formal fraud investigation 12 days after I filed my complaint. 2 federal investigators appeared at the offices of Holloway Group on a Monday morning at 8:47. Travis was not there when they arrived. He was in a meeting with a client across town. His office manager called him at 8:53. Travis called me 7 times before noon. I didn't answer any of them. The federal proceedings moved in parallel with the state-to-state litigation. Janet worked both tracks with the methodical patience of someone who has never once confused speed with thoroughness. She submitted the POA challenge documents in late October. The SBA fraud complaint carried its own investigative momentum once the OIG has a signed loan application with a veteran's credentials used without documented consent. The chain of liability is not difficult to construct. In December, Thomas Greer, Travis's business partner, the man who had received the email in October of the previous year, the one Travis sent 11 weeks after Kyle's funeral, reached out through his attorney with an offer to cooperate. The OIG had already flagged him as a secondary party. His attorney negotiated. He cooperated. The hearing was in January, in a federal courtroom in Nashville. I wore a navy blazer. Nathan stayed with Patricia. Janet had prepared for 6 weeks. Travis wore a gray suit, and the practiced expression of a man who has spent his life navigating rooms by performing whatever version of himself those rooms seem to require. He performed sincerity during the opening. He performed confusion during the early document presentation. By the time Janet laid the calendar page in front of the court, he had run out of performances. Travis's attorney tried 3 separate angles in the preliminary filings. The first, the POA, was a mutual agreement executed in good faith between family members during a period of shared grief. The second, the SBA loan, was a legitimate business decision made within the scope of a properly granted authority. The third, the calendar page, was speculative, circumstantial, and could not be reliably attributed to intent. Janet walked into that courtroom with 4 handwriting comparison samples from other authenticated documents in Travis's name, a forensic accountant who had spent 3 weeks mapping the Gatlinburg rental income disbursement trail, the testimony of the bank officer who had processed the joint account withdrawal using an authority that should not have extended to personal accounts, and Thomas Greer. Greer was the last witness Janet called. He had come to court in a brown suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, the suit of a man who had worn it to an occasion he was not prepared to attend. He sat in the witness box with his hands on the rail in front of him, and he looked at the middle distance between the judge and the gallery, which is where people look when they have decided the only way through something is to go straight and not sideways. Janet asked him to describe the conversation he'd had with Travis Holloway on the day of Kyle Holloway's funeral. Greer cleared his throat. Travis told me, he said, in the flat, careful voice of someone reading from an internal transcript they've rehearsed many times, that the business transfer would go through before Sarah recovered from grief. He paused. He said he had a window. He called it, those were his exact words. I remember them specifically because I remember thinking they were an unusual choice of phrase. He called it the optimal window. Nobody in that courtroom made a sound. The judge looked at Travis for a long time. A long, deliberate, specifically federal time. The kind of look that has the weight of institutional authority behind it. The look that says, I have seen a great many things in this room, and I am recording this one carefully. Travis's attorney leaned toward him and said something inaudible. Travis shook his head slightly. His attorney said it again. Travis was looking at the calendar page on the exhibit table, the August page, the one with the date circled in red, the handwriting that 3 forensic specialists had confirmed was his. The judge said, Counsel, I'd like to hear from your client regarding the document marked Exhibit 14F. Travis's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client maintains that the notation on Exhibit 14F represents routine estate planning documentation prepared in anticipation of the 14-4. I understand your client's position, the judge said. I'm asking about the date. A pause. The document is dated 22 days prior to the accident, the judge continued. It references a 6-month POA window, an estate attorney, and a specific account number, none of which are consistent with the description of routine estate planning. I'd like your client to address the date. Travis's attorney conferred with him for 30 seconds. Then he stood again. Your Honor, my client declines to address the document directly at this time. The judge looked at Travis for another long moment. That will be noted in the record, he said. Janet was already standing. The judgment was entered 6 weeks later. Travis was ordered to repay the $650,000 SBA loan in full. With accrued interest, the total obligation came to $718,400 by the time the calculation ran. The Gatlinburg rental compound was seized under fraud recovery statutes and liquidated at a court-supervised sale. The property brought $380,000, which was applied against the estate debt. The LLC restructuring that had transferred Kyle's ownership share into Travis's name was voided in its entirety, and Kyle's interest, which should have passed cleanly to Nathan through probate a year earlier, was restored to the estate. His share would be held in trust for Nathan until he turned 25. Travis's federal contractor certification was revoked. He could not submit a bid on a single public contract in the state of Tennessee. The company his father had built over 23 years, the company Travis had renamed to remove his brother's contribution, filed for bankruptcy 8 months after the judgment. 41 employees lost their jobs. I am aware that this is a more complicated number than the rest of them, and I have sat with it more than once. The last information I have is that Travis is working as a project manager for a residential remodeling company in Chattanooga. Hourly pay, no benefits. His name is not on the door. Renee Holloway had spent 14 months managing the community's understanding of what had happened to Kyle's family. She was extraordinarily good at it. She had decades of experience shaping narrative through church networks, through neighborhood association channels, through the careful, authoritative deployment of her own visible grief. She was the woman who had sat in my kitchen 3 weeks after the funeral and prayed aloud for my ability to be present for Nathan, now that I was no longer deployed, which was a prayer that managed to contain, inside its genuine seeming warmth, every piece of the story she needed people to believe about me. She was the one who had told neighbors, over months of casseroles and coffee, that Travis was the one who had stepped up. That Travis was the one who had kept Kyle's legacy intact while the military wife tried to figure out what came next. When the Knoxville News-Sentinel ran a 4-paragraph item on the fraud judgment in the business section below the fold, page 6, an uninflected summary of the key facts, it was enough. The people who knew Renee read it. The people who had attended the birthday party. The people who had nodded sympathetically at the women's auxiliary. The people who had driven past our house and felt grateful that at least the Holloway family was looking after Kyle's widow. However absent she'd been, they read it. The story Renee had carefully built over 14 months dissolved in the specific, unhurried way that stories dissolve when the foundation they were built on turns out to be structurally unsound. She stopped attending the women's auxiliary at her church in February. By spring, she had moved to Chattanooga to live with her younger sister. I heard this from a woman I barely knew who mentioned it at Nathan's school pickup. in the tone people use when they are conveying information they know is meaningful and are uncertain how the receiver will take it. I thanked her. I picked up Nathan. We drove home. The game was on a Saturday morning in April, the first genuinely warm weekend of real spring, the kind of morning so bright and clean and unremarkable in its beauty that it seems almost indifferent to what the winter was like. The baseball field at Nathan's school had been chalked fresh, and the infield dirt was still soft from rain 2 days before. I arrived early and sat in the third row of the aluminum bleachers on the first base side, with a coffee that was too hot to drink, and a jacket I didn't need by the time the first pitch was thrown. Patricia sat beside me. She had driven up from Nashville the night before. This is something she does 3 or 4 times a year, has done since Kyle died, because she is the kind of person who understands that presence is not the same thing as help, but it is never nothing either. She had brought a thermos of better coffee than mine, and she poured some into the cap of the thermos and handed it to me without commenting on what I was already holding. We watched Nathan take the mound for the top of the second inning. He was wearing the jersey number 14. Not because the coach had assigned it, the coach had given him 11, which was a reasonable number for a 9-year-old pitcher, and Nathan had come home from the first practice of the season and asked me, very carefully and seriously, whether I thought it would be okay to ask for a different number. I told him to ask his coach. He did. His coach said yes without making a thing of it, which was exactly the right response. And Nathan came home and reported this with the particular satisfaction of a child who has been treated with dignity by an adult. He had a way of standing on the mound that I recognized, but had no framework for, until I realized it was Kyle's posture. That same slight forward, lean into the pitch, the same deliberate stillness before the windup, the same look of quiet internal accounting that Kyle used to have when he was concentrating on something that mattered. Nathan didn't know he was doing it. That's how I knew it was real. Does he know everything yet? Patricia asked. I thought about it properly. I have been asked this question in various forms by various people over the past 6 months, and I have given different answers depending on the context. But sitting in those bleachers watching my son wind up for a fastball, I gave the honest one. He knows his dad loved him. He knows we won. He knows some people tried to take things that weren't theirs and that it didn't work. I paused. That's enough for now. And when he's older? I watched Nathan throw. Clean delivery, clean follow-through. The batter swung through it, and the umpire's arm went up, and Nathan turned back toward the dugout with his glove at his side, the cap brim catching the morning light. I'll tell him that his father was the kind of man worth fighting for, I said, and that his mother knew exactly how. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she handed me the thermos. The game ended with Nathan's team up by 2. There was ice cream after at a place on Kingston Pike that Nathan has been requesting since September. A low-lit diner with a milkshake menu handwritten on a chalkboard that changes seasonally. Nathan ordered something that arrived in a glass so large it required 2 hands to lift. He recounted every pitch of every inning while consuming approximately 40% of it, which is the maximum he can reach before the physics become insurmountable. Patricia drove back to Nashville that evening. Nathan went to bed at 9:15 with his cap on the nightstand and a book he was not reading, already asleep by the time I came in to turn off the light. I sat in the kitchen for a while after. The house was very quiet in the specific way. Houses are quiet when everyone you love is safe and accounted for and close enough to reach in seconds. I have not always had this. I did not always know that I wanted it until it was the thing I was fighting to protect. I held my phone for a long time. Then I opened the voicemail folder, scrolled to the bottom of it, all the way back, past the year of voicemails. I had mostly stopped keeping after a while, past the ones from the estate attorney and the bank and Patricia and Janet and the school, all the way down to the one from September 12th, 2 days before the accident. Left at 6:43 inches the evening, the sound of his car in the background and a radio turned low. I pressed play. Hey, it's me. The road underneath him. The radio. His voice exactly as I remember it. Not as I've reconstructed it from effort, but as it actually was. The specific frequency of it. The particular way he always spoke as if he was thinking of something warm. Just calling to say I'm proud of you. Always. That was it. The whole message. He hung up. I sat in the kitchen until the screen went dark, and then I set the phone on the table and I let the quiet be what it was. Here is what I know, and what I want to say plainly, without decoration. I spent 12 years learning how to find what people try to hide. I tracked supply chains and communication patterns and financial flows across 3 countries, for operations conducted by people who would never know my name and were not expected to acknowledge it. I sat in rooms where the intelligence I produced moved decisions that I was neither credited for nor permitted to discuss. I did that work because it needed to be done, and because I was built for it, and because I still believe that the people I was protecting deserved someone who took that protection seriously. Travis Holloway made a straightforward calculation when Kyle died. He calculated that the woman in the Honda Odyssey with the 9-year-old son, and the contractor job, and the quiet house was spent. That the years of competence were behind her. That grief and exhaustion, and the particular vulnerability of someone who has just lost the person who anchored her life, would create exactly the kind of opening he needed, and that by the time she understood what had happened, the legal clock would have run out. It was not a stupid calculation, as these things go. It was based on available evidence. It was wrong only because the available evidence did not include the thing that was hardest to see from the outside, which is that I had not stopped being what I had spent 12 years becoming. I had just stopped performing it. There is a difference between those two things that most people, in my experience, do not understand until they are standing in a federal courtroom watching a forensic accountant explain their own financial records to a judge. My call sign was Wraith. A Wraith doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't explain what it's doing or how long it intends to take. It appears in the right place, at the right time, with exactly the preparation the situation requires, and it does not leave until the work is done. I had spent a career being invisible on purpose, and the people who decided I was no longer worth watching had handed me the most useful gift available in any intelligence operation, the assumption that they were alone. I never wanted Travis to lose everything. That was not the goal, and it was not the standard. The goal was Nathan, and the standard was Kyle's work passing to the person Kyle had spent 11 years building it for. Those two things happened to require the same outcome. That was not my choice. It was the result of Travis's choices, and I am at peace with that in the way you are at peace with a thing when you know you did not manufacture it. I think about something Kyle said once, on a night when he was tired and we were sitting in the dark of the back porch after Nathan had gone to bed. He said, "The thing about being the quiet one is, people keep filling in the silence with whatever they need it to mean, and you can let them. And then you find out exactly what they think of you. And then you know exactly who you're dealing with." He was 29 years old when he said that. He was talking about a colleague at his school. He had no idea that sentence would one day apply to his brother and a court of federal jurisdiction. But Kyle was always like that. He said true things simply, without knowing they were going to last. Real strength is not the loudest voice in the room. It never was. It is the quiet one who already knows how the story ends, and has the patience to let everyone else keep talking until the geometry is right. The ones who mistake your silence for weakness have never understood the difference between someone who has nothing left to say and someone who is simply waiting for the right moment to speak. I am still waiting for the right moments. I always will be. That is what it means to be Wraith.